Hello, fellow real estate agents in the state of California. This is Chris Barbeau. I am going to do a quick tutorial on completing the new residential listing agreement. With the recent NAR settlement, there's been quite a few changes to the format and some of the forms that print with it. I'm not going to do a paragraph by paragraph instructional on the form, but I'm going to at least cover some of the changes and some of the basics of completing this form. Definitely, you always want to consult with your broker first, but hopefully this will give you a general idea of the new form. Sort of it'll highlight a little bit some of the changes that came down as a result of the NAR settlement, and hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the form right now. So the listing agreement prints and always has with the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. The general gist of this form is that it explains to your client what a seller's agent is, what a buyer's agent is, and what a dual agent is, and what their responsibilities are. So it's prints with the listing agreement, it prints with the offer. You should always have your client sign this first, and it is a required disclosure in the state of California. Running right into the residential listing agreement. So the format has changed completely. If you've seen the residential purchase agreement, hopefully, you'll notice it's in a grid format, much like the RPA. So everything you're filling out is in the first page or so, and all the paragraphs that are referenced here in this column. And so if you want more information on any of these things, you're going to run to the paragraph that's referenced. But let's jump into how to fill this thing out. So date prepared is the date you're preparing this agreement, not the start date of the listing. The seller's name is going to go here. The brokerage name is going to go here. So who they're employing, it's the brokerage name, not the agent. The address of the property gets filled out. The parcel number hopefully gets filled out here. And jumping right into the grid and the terms of the listing agreement. So listings can no longer, listings for residential 1 to 4 properties being sold by anything other than a corporation, LLC, or partnership can no longer be longer than 2 years. So that is a recent change. This is your start date and your ending date of the listings. You'll fill that in. Your listing price goes here. If it's mobile home, you're going to check a box. If it's probate or conservatorship or guardianship, you're checking that box there. And it'll incorporate the addendums that you need for that. All right, compensation. We're going to talk about compensation as it's called on the listing agreement. So the big changes to compensation is that this agreement is now just what the seller is going to pay their agent for their side of the transaction. So that's what you're putting in this section C1, compensation of the seller's broker, only the seller's side of the transaction. Whether it's a percent, a flat rate, or you have some kind of compensation schedule. I didn't fill this in for obvious reasons because of the settlement, but basically whatever your policy is or whatever you're going to get compensated for, just the listing side of the transaction. So a relatively new thing here is this section about unrepresented buyers. So that's truly a buyer that comes into the picture that says, hey, I don't have an agent. I don't want to be represented by anybody. I'm representing myself. That's essentially what this is about. I don't know that we're going to see a lot of it, but it could come up definitely with some of the new changes. This is not what you're going to put for dual agency. That's handled under a buyer rep agreement. So this is just that unrepresented buyer. You're going to check this box. I think it's a good idea to get compensated if you're going to be dealing with somebody that doesn't have an agent. You're going to put some compensation here for you to handle that transaction, keeping in mind that any conversation you're having with this person is really for the benefit of the seller, and you should give them buyer non-agency disclosure as a result of that. So just be careful of what you're doing here when as far as conversations you're having with this person. You want to be careful not to tread into having an agency relationship with them. You're not advising them in any way. Okay, so this next section here is for, let's say you this continuation of right to compensation. Let's say a buyer saw the property while you had it listed, and then a month after it expired, they made an offer on it, or they waited for the listing to expire to go directly to the seller. This period here is what prevents that from, well, not prevents it from happening, but gives you compensation if that does happen. So you may want to put something in here to cover that period after the listing expires or is canceled. If your seller is under any obligation to pay another broker for any reason, maybe a previous broker, it expired and they had one of these continuation periods, you probably should put that here so that you're, that it's in writing that they actually owe somebody else as well. Items included and excluded. Be sure to write these in and be as clear as possible. If you're not sure, you should write it in. I've seen sheds disappear. I've seen all kinds of things leave a property, and people not understanding what a fixture is versus not a fixture. Spell it out. Talk to your seller about it. Put it here. Anything leased, solar is a big one now. Make sure you cover that with your seller. You're going to check it here. Or there's a lien, a solar lien. They have a loan on their solar, and it's a lien on the property. Talk about that. Fill these boxes out. Smart features are another thing. I've seen Ring doorbells disappear. So you want to definitely address, are those things staying? They're not staying. Just be clear about it. You're going to indicate here what MLS you're using. So the property is going to be marketed in this MLS. There's a new box here, and we'll talk a little bit more about it further down. But essentially, if you have a seller that doesn't want any interior property pictures or video or anything of their property, you're going to check this box. Difficult to sell a property without that, but you never know. You could have a seller that's just like, nope. Now, keep in mind that most MLS rules require at least a picture of the front. So that is something you're going to have to talk to your seller about. All right, this is just about when are you going to present offers to the seller. By default, it's going to be as soon as possible after you receive it. Okay, this is something I do want to touch on, this buyer supplemental offer letters, buyer letters. Sometimes we call them buyer love letters. By default, the contract says you're not going to provide those to a seller. So if you get an offer and the buyer has written this lovely letter about why they're the best person buying that house, by default, you're not giving that to the seller, and it's really for fair housing reasons. So if the seller does want those letters, you're going to check this box here, and by doing so, you're putting them on notice that they're basically acting against your advice by receiving them. So just be cautious of that. It does tread into fair housing territory. Any reports that have been done on the property already, you're going to check here and include them as a disclosure, obviously. If the seller is wanting to buy another property and they want to make this sale contingent upon them finding or buying another property, you're going to check this box. And that's going to be negotiated later into your offer. All right. So again, I don't want to cover all the nitty-gritty on this form. Remember that grid references all the paragraphs in the contract. Please read them and understand them. I don't want to go into a ton of detail of every paragraph on this form, but you definitely should understand it and read it. We get to the bottom of the listing agreement. One thing I do want to point out is this whole section about entity sellers. I see this done incorrectly all the time. If you have a trust, if you have a corporation, if you have a probate, if you have anything other than a seller's name selling a property, you're going to check this box because you do need to identify who the authorized signer is and put their name right here. So just be sure you're doing that. Otherwise, your file compliance person may reject your file and ask you to do this RCSD form, which basically is the same exact format. So save yourself some time, fill it in. Keep in mind that if your seller is a trust, they can be identified a couple of ways on your contract. They can be, their name as trustee or co-trustee. That's fine. It can also be a simplified trust name like the Doe Revocable Family Trust. That's okay too. Keep in mind if you're using an entity name like the Doe Revocable Family Trust as your seller on all your contracts, when you're sending something for digital signature, please be sure to change it so that it doesn't get signed as the Doe Revocable Family Trust. That isn't a signature. You want the signature of the authorized signer. And just to say it, every digital signature platform that I've seen associated with the contracts allows you to do that. You just got to learn how to do it. We've seen in file compliance many times where that was done incorrectly. So it should be the name of the signer signing it. Whether the seller is an entity or a trust name, the name of the signer, the authorized signer, is who should be signing. You'll want to include here the name of the trust, the complete name, etc. Or if it's probate, the full name of the estate, including the case number. And then they sign it down here. Okay, multiple listing service addendum. This came out July 24th. Prints with your listing. Talks about what an MLS is, why you should use the MLS, that there's this thing called the clear cooperation policy, that properties need to go in the MLS within 1 day after being marketed publicly, what the risks of doing that are. Talks a little bit about the coming soon status. Some MLSs have a coming soon policy, some don't. So be sure to follow your MLS rules for that. Let's see. They don't want to authorize you to market the property as coming soon. You're going to check this box here. If the seller wants you to hold off on any marketing for a period of time, this is the section to do it. Otherwise, by default, you're putting it in the MLS within 1 day of getting your listing signed. Or if they want to delay it, you're going to put it here and you're going to put the date here. If they don't want it marketed to the public for some reason, this is where you're going to do this. I'm not sure how they're going to sell the property that way, but it can happen. And also, just to say it, there's this box that talks about the clear cooperation policy not applying. I guess there's MLSs that don't follow the clear cooperation policy. I don't belong to any of them, but maybe you do. Just understand your MLS rules. They're all different. Every MLS is different. So be sure you understand what the rules are. I would say all the MLSs I belong to require that if you're going to publicly market a property, that it has to be in their system within 1 day. And that's basically what the clear cooperation policy is. Okay, it's going to talk about, let's talk about concessions. So with the new listing agreement, there is no place to offer a buyer-broker compensation anymore. CAR has taken a pretty strict stand on a more conservative approach on broker-to-broker cooperation, and there is no mechanism to do this. So when you're on the buying side of a transaction representing a buyer, you're going to have a buyer representation agreement with them. They're going to agree to compensate you. Now, you can try to negotiate for the seller to give a concession towards some of those fees to help your buyer out. And that's where all of that's going to be done. All buyer agent, any concessions done from the seller to the buyer to credit towards their agent's commission is all done at the time of offer now. So if your seller is willing to consider any concessions at all, there's this new section here that says they might, consider concessions. By default, the agreement says they are not willing to have you publicly put that in the MLS or put that in the MLS. And most MLSs are going to have some sort of field about concessions now. Remember, this is, they might consider it. Not they are, not they're going to, there's no agreement in the MLS for that. So they might consider it. And so if they do want to use that as a marketing strategy where they might consider concessions and check that box, you're going to be checking this box on this form, B2. Seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions if allowed under the rules, the MLS rules. So make sure you know your MLS rules. Even if permitted by the MLS, no amount of the possible concession will be stated in the MLS, either as a percent of the purchase price or a flat fee, unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount. And just keep in mind, most MLSs, the new NAR settlement doesn't allow amounts to be in there. So you really want to be careful with this. There's MLSs out there, with huge fines. I've heard $2,500, $2,000. Be very careful what you're doing here. Again, here's the section on photographs. By default, visitors are not restricted from taking photographs of the property. Most MLSs are adopting a new model rule that basically says that if a seller doesn't want a visitor to take pictures, you're going to check this box and you're going to put in the MLS that it's not allowed. One of the MLSs, a couple of the MLSs I belong to are having a new field for this. Just be careful. This is like buyers coming in and taking pictures, or even agents, right? Buyers' agents coming in and taking pictures and putting those on the internet. If your seller doesn't want that, they can opt out of that now. Obviously, appraisals and inspection reports are a different thing, but just be careful of this. This is a new thing. Excuse me. All right, jumping into the seller's advisory. This has always been here for the most part, for a long time anyway. It just talks about the seller's obligations to disclose any known issues with the property. Okay, new broker compensation advisory. Prints with the listing agreement. Talks about commissions are fully negotiable. They always have been. They always will be, we think, or we hope. But basically, it's always been this way, but this is fully putting the seller on notice that their listing compensation is fully negotiable. That you may ask them for additional compensation if a buyer comes across that's not represented. We talked about that on the front of the listing agreement, right? I personally don't believe that it's in a buyer's best interest to be unrepresented. They should have representation, but it may come up. And if it does, there might be some additional compensation for you as a listing agent if you negotiated that on the first page of your RLA. It puts them on notice that there's possible dual agency. It can happen. But it also tells them that buyer compensation is also fully negotiable, and that because of this class action lawsuit, buyers are required to have a written buyer representation agreement before they see a property. And that agreement must identify the amount of compensation that buyer's agent is going to receive. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you have an agreement with a buyer as a buyer agent, and let's say you have a buyer that's interested in your listing in this case, you're going to have a buyer representation agreement with that buyer. And if your buyer wants some of that compensation to be covered in the form of a concession from your seller, you're writing that in your offer and asking for it as a negotiable item. And just keep in mind that you as a buyer's agent cannot receive more than what you agreed to on your buyer's agreement. So if you have a buyer agreement and you put X amount and you're negotiating for your seller and you've asked the seller for some concessions, and the seller's offering for some reason a concession amount higher than what you have with your buyer's agreement, you can't accept that. The max that you can accept is what you had in agreement with your buyer, rep agreement with your buyer. So let's see, and it spells that out here. The broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of the amount specified in the buyer rep agreement. Remember, buyer pays the compensation pursuant to a buyer rep agreement. So not the listing broker. The seller can pay that compensation in the form of, negotiating at the time of offer for some sort of concession, but it's at the time of offer. Okay, just keep that in mind. And it talks a little bit about here, what the changes were for the seller. So, I'd read through this section with them so they have a full understanding of it. The possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, this disclosure and consent, this form's been around for a long time. Talks about, multiple buyers, multiple sellers, dual agency, offers aren't necessarily confidential, that sort of thing. Here we go with the fair housing and discrimination advisory. Be careful with anything that you're doing everything fairly with everybody. You're not treating one person different than any other in any way, shape, or form. And we'll go ahead and roll back down into the California Consumer Privacy Act. This came out a couple years ago as well. This is just another advisory for your client that they should read. And that pretty much wraps it up on the listing side. So definitely some big changes to the way the format of the form. It's in line with the NAR settlement. Just keep in mind the big change is obviously that there's no pre-agreed amount that you're going to be offering to a buyer's agent as compensation from the seller. It's all negotiated at time of offer now. So buyer has an agreement with their agent. Listing broker has an agreement with their seller. And if there's any concessions being given by the seller towards the buyer's compensation, it's negotiated with the offer. So obviously big changes, and hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And remember, consult with your own broker on what your rules are. Be sure you're following your MLS rules, because every MLS has different rules. And get out there and sell some houses.